It's interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth. And to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. Have you ever been told to your face that you have no friends, that you're a loser, that the popular kid had only been hanging out with you because his mom was making him, not because he actually liked you? I have. It happened in front of my entire class when I was 13 years old. I was lucky, though. Back when I was being bullied, basically daily, those bullies couldn't get to my home. They couldn't get to that special isolated place along the rocky shoreline of Lake Huron, and they were never with me when I was tending my wildflower garden. When I was 10 years old, shortly after my mother died, my dad said I could take over a section of our garden, my very own entangled bank. I spent the next 10 years tending that garden, planting ferns and wildflowers, watching as new fronds unfurled and new kinds of wildflowers bloomed. Tiny redback salamanders and white-lipped forest snails and garter snakes called my garden home. I watched nature closely, and usually alone. I'd scan the forests and surrounding countryside and rescue orchids from soon-to-be-expanded roadsides. Eventually, I put in a small pond. I planted a water lily, some cattails, marsh marigolds, and watercress. Not long after that, green frogs moved in, and their loose banjo string calls echoed across our property. In the spring, the trills of American toads filled the damp spring evenings. And during those long, cold, snowy Great Lakes winters, I really looked forward to the first signs of spring in my pond. Those tiny, bright green shoots from the marsh marigolds brought an 11-year-old kid an inordinate amount of joy, as did later the bulbous, bright yellow flowers of the rescued lady slipper orchids. That garden was my space to be curious about nature, but it was my space to be curious in the absence of judgment and in the absence of bullies. Away from the garden, I felt misunderstood. I felt isolated and alone. I was different for a little boy. I liked My Little Ponies. I collected stickers. I liked art. I started figure skating when I was 6 years old, and my voice sounded like my voice pre-puberty, which was much gayer. I was an obvious target, and I was targeted all the time. I was first called gay when I was 7 or 8 years old on the playground, and I was actually not called gay, I was called a faggot by someone who I thought was my friend. Later, it was someone I had never even met, someone who didn't know of my love for My Little Ponies, my love for collecting stickers, my love of nature. He'd never even heard my voice, but he knew I figure skated and made the assumption that I must be gay. I think it didn't help that we shared the same first name, and somehow he resented me for that. Eventually, I left my entangled bank. I went to university just 2 hours from where I grew up, but it felt like an entirely different planet. I almost dropped out. I missed home. I missed the place that I felt safe. I didn't know who I was in that setting, but there was a lot of pressure to know. And none of my coping mechanisms were available to me. I had none of my own space. I had a roommate. Then I lived in a shared house. The river that ran through campus was beautiful to walk along, but it wasn't Lake Huron. And the Arboretum was also beautiful, but an unfamiliar forest. I really struggled. I focused on school, where I excelled, obviously. And I did what was socially expected of me. In the middle of my junior year, after dating a woman for a year and feeling incredibly uncomfortable about who I was, I decided that in my senior year, I would live alone in a basement apartment. And thinking back, that was the first space that I actually felt free the whole time that I was at university. It wasn't a garden full of wildlife and wildflowers. It was a quiet basement apartment where I could also be curious, this time not about nature, but about myself. And I tested the waters in that basement apartment, but not in the way you might be thinking. I could sit there alone, away from the prying eyes of my kind and curious friends, and I could say out loud, I think I'm gay, which was extremely hard for me to verbalize for a very long time. And I could sit with that and see how it felt. How did it feel to say, I think I'm gay? What did it make me feel? And it was in that quiet basement apartment that I decided to live authentically when I went to graduate school the following year. The entangled bank is described in this excellent book, The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is the foundation upon which modern evolutionary studies are built. Studies I now conduct. As an associate professor at CU Boulder, I study how new bird species form, what happens when different species interbreed with one another, and why that happens. We use field studies combined with whole genome sequencing, which up until 10 years ago was unheard of, the whole genome sequencing part. I work with the public here in Boulder. I work with an amazing group of graduate students, postdocs, and undergraduate students. We've made some incredible discoveries about the connections between genomes and the way birds look, as well as between the actions humans are engaging with on the planet and what that does to how different species interact. And everybody knows that I'm gay. They know about my partner Zach, who's here tonight, and our dog Douglas. They know that sometimes I paint my nails. They know that I really love Beyonce. And they know that I go overboard at Halloween, and we're talking like 12-foot skeleton overboard, kind of overboard. And it's totally fine. My space to be curious about both who I am and the world has really grown. My tangled bank now is literally the planet. We study birds from the high Arctic to the high Alpine to the coasts of South America. My space to be curious about who I am has also grown. It's our house in Denver. It's my office here on campus. It's the CU Boulder Mountain Research Station that I'm the director of. And right now, it's this auditorium. But the reality is that I'm an outlier. Many people in the queer community don't make it this far, and I almost didn't make it this far. Because of the bullying we face, some of us decide that life isn't worth living. If we decide to stay, we face higher rates of attrition from post-secondary education, particularly from STEM. And we're still experiencing daily attacks on our basic human rights that seem to be increasing recently. I'm often asked what it means to be a queer scientist, and I don't have an answer for that question. I don't think I ask questions differently than straight people. I do think my talks have better aesthetics, typically, than the straights. But broadly, I just think it means that we can be scientists, that we can contribute just as much as anyone else to the problems that face our planet or why different species arise or whatever. I think for me personally, it means that finding my space to be curious both about nature in the absence of bullies, in the absence of judgment, and also my space to figure out who I am was incredibly important and has allowed me to succeed in my role here at CU. This summer, I was home visiting my family and I went back to my garden. It's still there. It's much more of an entangled bank than it was when I was tending it daily. And I'm always shocked by how small it is. It's 12 feet by 3 feet. It's smaller even than my office on campus. And it's still filled with the ferns and the orchids that I planted as a kid. That little pond is still there with the yellow pond lily. My dad makes sure that the pond is full of water. And I like to think that the little redback salamanders that I can still find there are the ones that I interacted with so long ago as a kid. And I have so much gratefulness for that garden. But I think I'm even more grateful that I don't need that garden anymore. And I also don't need a small basement apartment to know who I am. Thank you.